Today I'm with Christopher Banister. He is an English for academic purposes lecturer at Regent's University in London. I'm going to be asking him a few questions relating to EFL teaching and the TEFL industry in general. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Banister.
Thank you for inviting me, Caitlin.
Would you mind introducing yourself and explaining a little bit about your background in the TEFL industry?
Okay, well I qualified as a teacher back in 1997 when I did my Trinity celt-p, and after doing that in the UK I moved to Istanbul in Turkey to take up my first teaching role, and I worked there in a very nice school called the English Centre in central Istanbul for 4 years, which was a really great sort of formative experience. I learned so much very quickly, not just about teaching and learning, but also about, in this case it was Turkish culture, which I found very, very interesting. And then after that, after the first 4 years, I then decided to do a diploma. And as I did the Delta, it immediately brought me quite a lot of benefits. I realised that I could be more independent, more autonomous, and I was able to work freelance, take on quite a lot of private students and do some in-company work, which I found rewarding because it was very targeted. Students are very clear about what they wanted from the lessons, which in turn helped me to prepare lessons that I knew were going to be quite relevant for them. And after 8.5 years in Turkey, I moved back to the UK and started to work in London, again in company, freelance, one-to-one lessons, and then I started to work in further education in London, which was an interesting experience, working with refugees and also many of the workers from EU countries had come to work in the UK at that time. And finally, more recently, I've been working at Regent's in London, first teaching general English and exams English, things like IELTS courses, and after that I've been working for the last 5 years in EAP, English for Academic Purposes, where actually my role involves teaching both business English and academic English to our students, but also to exchange students who come from partner universities around the world.
That's great. That's a very wide breadth of experience.
Yeah, and I feel very lucky to have had that breadth of experience. It really shows you the different worlds of learning English that there are out there.
Our course is just ending, our Trinity celt-p course, and our student teachers who have been with us for the past 3.5 months. They're now fully certified and about to enter the world of EFL teaching. Do you have any advice for EFL teacher hopefuls who are looking into entering the TEFL industry and making EFL teaching a career path?
Well, yeah, I think it's a very exciting time for them to be in this position. Places like China, which maybe were not open as much to people starting off in their careers maybe 10 or 15 years ago, now are very much open. So I think there's a world of opportunities out there, and if you do want to make a career of EFL, there are ways to do that. Things like studying for a diploma at some point would be a logical step, and also things like getting involved in some kind of classroom research. Both of those could stand you in good stead if you want to progress your career. A lot of countries now are looking for EAP tutors and lecturers, so if you do want to get involved in that long term, then you need to be thinking about what you could add to your CV, which is going to make you more employable in a sort of academic context especially.
Since you are currently an EAP lecturer, I wanted to touch a bit on that, as that might be a topic that new EFL teachers are not as familiar with. Can you explain the differences of an EAP classroom as opposed to a standard EFL classroom, and how do EFL teachers need to adjust in order to meet these variations in the class?
Yeah, and I agree with you. Certainly when I first qualified, and then in the early years of my career, I didn't really know what EAP was, and then I started to hear it mentioned. I think as universities have put more emphasis on having an international student base it's grown and grown and grown. So the main difference, as I see it, would be that obviously students who are on EAP courses are either very close to starting university, or if it's an in-sessional course, one which is run alongside students' actual studies in the subject that they are, undertaking, then there's quite a lot of pressure in that situation, both for the teachers and for the learners themselves. I mean, of course, there's all kinds of pressure in all kinds of English lessons, because we know that students take exams and things like IELTS are important, but it is a different kind of pressure, and you're asking someone potentially to be studying English whilst they are studying in English. So it's quite an ask in many ways, but I think the key thing for an EAP teacher to realise is that you may still be a specialist in language in the general sense, but you are inevitably not going to be a specialist in the language, in the way that the English language is used in a variety of different disciplines. So there is a difference between the way vocabulary, for example, is used in engineering or mathematics or business or psychology, and it's very unlikely that one person can be aware of all those subtleties and distinctions. So in a sense, you're there very much to facilitate students understanding how the language is used in their discipline. And you may find yourself, that can be quite disconcerting to realise that actually to learn what you don't know. And that has happened many times. So I think for an EAP teacher, it's important to be able to get students to look at what might be called more general academic language that might be more widely applicable across disciplines, but then to also be aware that in their particular area it could be used differently, or it could be seen as inappropriate. So it's about making them aware that their discipline has a particular way of doing things. So I think that's really the key difference.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's that acquisition of technical language that can really be maybe a stumbling block or something that an EFL teacher wouldn't have thought about previously.
That's it. You come across uses of language that you yourself might not think are possible, but then you see it in the context and you realise that it is used that way in psychology or engineering, whatever it may be. So you have to constantly sort of reassess what is possible.
What are your kind of tips or advice on how to investigate classroom practices in order to help new teachers develop in their teaching autonomously, as opposed to receiving feedback, possibly from a course tutor who has observed the student's lesson?
Okay, well, over the last few years I've become involved in a form of teacher research called exploratory practice. And exploratory practice is a way of getting teachers to focus on what's going on in their classrooms and to try to understand better some of they're called puzzles in exploratory practice. Try to understand these puzzles, these questions, which I think are all around us as teachers. And because you are on your own in the classroom usually, with your learners of course, but on your own, not with other teachers, you have these things which occur to you all the time, and you often informally share these ideas with people in the staff room after class, your colleagues, but often it doesn't go any further than that. And I think EP is a way to go a bit deeper and to reflect more in a formalised way and to enhance your understanding of what's going on in the classroom, and in that way to potentially develop yourself as a teacher and to bring yourself more into sort of to get your learners' vantage point, your learners' viewpoint on what is actually going on in your classroom. And I think this can be a really good way for teachers to develop, and they could potentially do this themselves. Luckily for me, I was involved in this initially in a group, which really helped to be able to be part of a group and to collaborate and to share our ideas about our own puzzles that we were exploring. So that supportive environment is really good. So if teachers can find other teachers that might be interested in doing this with them, then I think that's a really good way to go about sort of deepening your knowledge of the classroom, and also adding sort of points to your CV, because you can then say, you've explored your classroom, you've conducted some sorts of research there, and that you're in touch with your learners, which I think most employers will look at very positively.
Great, thank you for that explanation. I was previously unfamiliar with this concept, and it's great to know that there are kind of new methods being discovered and being implemented in order to help teachers develop in their teaching, and I certainly look forward to this being more widespread throughout teacher training. How do you view the differences in EFL teaching, let's say in a country such as the UK, where you are teaching, let's say, English as a second language to speakers of many different other languages, as opposed to teaching English as a foreign language, let's say in Austria, where the classrooms are monolingual, all the students are German speaking. Can you touch a little bit on the differences you view in teaching those in those two different scenarios?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think one of the differences is obviously that in a multilingual classroom, that fear that the teacher sometimes has that students will resort to their first language in unwanted situations or scenarios has kind of been taken away as an option for most of the students. If you've got a Turk, a Thai, a French student, and someone from, Colombia, it's going to be very hard for them to communicate in any other language apart from English much of the time. So in a sense, that issue is potentially resolved. However, there's another side to it, because I remember when I was teaching in Turkey, it was sometimes reassuring that as I learnt a little bit of Turkish myself, and I could understand students' mutterings and whisperings which go on, and sometimes it would confirm for me that they were enjoying an activity, and sometimes it would confirm that, as I suspected, sadly, they were really bored, or whatever the case may be. But it did in a way let you know where you were with things. Obviously, that's not an option in a multilingual class, again, because the teacher will not be familiar with such a range of languages. And I also remember in the schools I worked at in Turkey, which were largely a monolingual environment, there was a lot of pressure on teachers to minimise or even completely eradicate Turkish from the classroom, which at the time I bought into, to be honest with you. I've changed my stance on it slightly. I thought at the time it was good to create this environment where English was the only language, and the home language was, for a couple of hours during the class, was sort of something which was not going to be brought in. The thing is, though, that even if you take away verbal expressions of the language, of course it's natural, people translate, they do, in their mind. As soon as you teach them a word, they're searching around for the equivalent first language word, or words, or group of words. So I would still say that I'm an advocate of having as much done in the classroom as possible in English. This is the main reason why we're here, but you do have to accept that there will be some first language interference, even if it's not verbalised, even if you don't hear it, it will be going on inside the learner's mind. So, I think that's obviously one of the key differences, isn't it, between working in a monolingual environment and a multilingual one. It's the influence of the first language is much more explicit in a monolingual one if you allow it to be, certainly.
Where do you see the TEFL industry going in the next 5 to 10 years? Where is it heading in the future? And along that line, what skills do you think EFL teachers need to develop in order to stay relevant in this fast-growing industry?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think when we look at things like Google Translate, we start to occasionally worry for our profession years from now. They're not quite there yet, but they'll get there at some point, I think. I think for teachers, there's always going to be a role for a teacher. There's always going to be a role for a human element. However, that might be a human element that is delivered via Skype, online. So things like getting involved in blended courses and the design of materials for blended courses to ensure that you keep some communicative and interactive element to these things, because I think there is a danger that the technology takes over sometimes, and you have these courses which are, they claim to be delivered in a very innovative way, but when you actually look at the materials, it's just the platform that is innovative. The materials themselves have actually sometimes gone a little bit backwards. So I think it's being able to get involved in these sort of projects if you have a chance. Anything involving blended learning is going to be the way that things are going to be going in the long term, I think. So I think I'd probably single out blended learning as something for teachers to invest some time in familiarising themselves with, and if they have the chance to get involved in those sort of projects, to do so.
Great, thank you for that answer, Mr. Banister. This is always an interesting question to ask, and I'm always really interested in learning from people who have been in the industry for a long time and really have those insights into the direction of the industry, having observed patterns from previous years and able to kind of see where the research is heading, where the methodologies are heading.
Yes, but bear in mind, Caitlin, that plenty of predictions have been made which have turned out to be wrong. So no one really knows, but certainly at university level where I teach, this is the big growth area, blended learning.
I just wanted to ask if you have any final remarks or any final words of advice for newcomers to the TEFL industry.
Well, I think, as I said before, I think newcomers to this industry are entering it now at a very exciting time. I think much of the world which wasn't open when I started teaching now to some extent is open. So I'm thinking of places like the ex-Soviet states and China, places like that. So there's a world of opportunities out there, and it's a case of different things suit different people at different times in their lives. If you want to have an experience and learn something about new culture, then teaching English is a fantastic way to do that. And I think that's how a lot of people start off. But then once you've done that for a few years, if you are interested in developing it as a proper career, the opportunities are there. So I think that the advice would be to reflect and see where you are after a couple of years and see, is that the same place as you imagined, and to as with any career plan, is to reflect constantly and to see how you think you're making progress and what the opportunities around you at the time are.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to sit down with me and answer all my questions. I really appreciate you doing that and providing all of your thoughtful answers and insight into the industry.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you for inviting me here today and for the questions, which are very interesting for me to answer as well.